Well, all right, everyone, it's a couple of minutes past the hour, so I think we will go ahead and make a start. I wanted to first welcome all of you to this presentation, which is part of the Ali Vural Ak Center's webinar series on COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity. My name is Peter Mandeville. I'm the director of the Ali Vural Ak Center and also a professor of government and politics in the Schar School of Policy and Government, both at George Mason University. We're delighted today to be joined by Dr. Anna Piela, who's a visiting scholar at the Department of Religious Studies, Northwestern University, and Dr. Joanna Krotofil, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Religious Studies at Jagiellonian University in Krakow in Poland. And they will be speaking to us today on the topic, I've discovered I love to pray alone, women's approaches to practicing Islam during the COVID-19 pandemic. If you want to turn your attention to the chat box, you'll see a variety of links, information about the Ali Vural Ak Center and an opportunity for you to be subscribed to our listserv that will allow you to receive notifications of events and publications. And if you would like to know more about the background and expertise of our two speakers today, you'll see also links to their online professional biographical profiles, as well as a link to a joint research project that they're working on together, which examines Polish female converts to Islam. There's also in there a link to the various other presentations that have been made in this webinar series on COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity, which we've been running since the middle of June and will be concluding later this semester in December. I also wanted, by way of look ahead, to make sure that you're aware of an upcoming event that we are organizing here at the center. This is the 4th annual Graduate Student Book Review Colloquium, which is part of the wider Fall for the Book Literary Festival, which takes place every year here in Northern Virginia, and to which our center has been contributing for the last few years. And if you're interested in seeing the various books that will be explored during that event or would like to attend, you'll also find a link here in the chat room. I wanted to let you all know that we will be recording this afternoon's event. And if you've registered for the event, you will receive a link to it. And also this will, of course, enable those who are interested in the session, but were not able to attend today to view it later. I also wanted to acknowledge and thank my colleague Ayşenur Solmezkara, who's here working with us and providing logistical and technical support throughout the session. So without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to our two speakers, beginning first, I believe, with Joanna. Joanna, please, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I will now try to share my screen. Can everyone see the presentation, the first slide? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much for having us here. Anna and I, we are both delighted with this opportunity to present and discuss our work. We will talk about a research which we started on the premise that the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent lockdown would affect the ways people do Islam, to put it simply, especially given the importance of collective practice for Muslims. Although, of course, for different groups, the reasons for this might be different. We'll highlight in this presentation that for some, the pandemic has made their ways of doing religion more common. And by their ways, we mean practicing Islam in physical isolation, praying alone, being connected to other Muslims through digital means, for example, participating in religious prayers online or attending an online mosque. These were by many considered practices from the margins, which are usually commonplace among converts, single parents, mothers of young children, the disabled, as well as transgender, queer, or radically progressive Muslims. and suddenly these practices have become ordinary. In our analysis, we employ the framework of lived religion and the notion of sacralization of the self. The focus on lived religion allows us to pay attention to agency exhibited by women who make sense of Islam in their everyday lives and practices affected by the pandemic. We also pay close attention to the tensions between some of the theoretical concepts. So we'll be looking at agency versus authority, as well as religious individualization and collectivism. Our findings evidence a wide variety of personal outcomes in relation to the intensity and quality of religious practice, religious and personal development, the individually constructed meaning of the isolation and solitude, the engagement with religious authority, and family and gender relations. Of course, the wider implications of these outcomes will be different for different people. For example, Katrina Thompson noted how important in-person, collective, corporeal prayer was for many non-conforming Muslims as a site of unlearning the old religious habitus, for example, the expectation of sex segregation in mosques, and learning new habitus, so participating comfortably in mixed gender prayer. Saba Mahmood, on the other hand, observed the importance of practice, including the prayer, for conservative, traditionally pious women. For them, the prayer had cultivate the pious disposition by creating a particular emotional state. So with the mosques closed down, this experience of coming together would be unavailable for most. And so we wondered how our participants would respond to this situation. We assume gendered impact of the COVID-19 restrictions on religious practices in Muslim communities. Popular media and some community activists commented extensively on the gendered aspect of the new religious reality. One of the most popular observations was that now men would be affected by the exclusion from the collective, which for many women was a commonplace experience before the pandemic. Women's engagement with mosques, as was discussed in these webinar series before, is very often restricted by small sex-segregated women's spaces, or, as some of our participants highlighted, by patriarchal messaging. And finally, gendered roles in the family may mean that women simply have less time or no time to spend on prayer and meditation, especially during a busy time like Ramadan. This does not mean that communal prayer is not desired by women. On the contrary, for many, especially for converts or those who are away from the family, mosques may be the only place where they can experience togetherness in faith. So we assume that the absence of community-based practices and celebrations could potentially create a space for new modes of engagement. So the aim of our study was to map out the impact of social isolation and distancing on religious practices of Muslim women. And we are using Ramadan in particular as a sort of magnifying glass to look at the impact of these restrictions. Our data comes from an online survey. We asked a number of open questions about strategies used to cope with physical isolation during 2020 Ramadan, about new aspects of spirituality or religious practice discovered by our participants or emphasized under the lockdown. We asked about self-care practices, gender family dynamics, and some questions about the demographic details. We distributed invitations to take part in the study using personal networks, but also using help of some Muslim organizations and local community leaders. Now about our sample. We received responses from 38 Muslim women of different backgrounds and affiliations. And as you can see, they are mainly, although not exclusively, from the US and the UK. A large part of our sample represents a progressive orientation, and this was declared explicitly or expressed implicitly. 20% of our participants were rural-based, and one participant was transgender. So we are focusing on non-conformist Islam, to use Katrina Thompson's term. And we are hoping to fill a gap between a well-established macro-level study of political Islam and a micro-level focus on individual Islamic practice and its diversity. Further, by engaging ordinary Muslims, rather than scholars, writers, or activists who are usually the focus of work on progressive Islam, we want to center on everyday life practices and discourses. Now, coming to our findings, I will start with the kind of first theme or category of findings, and that is the intensity and quality of religious practice. The majority of women who participated in our survey experienced some changes in their religious practices. Many of our respondents were striving to align their daily rhythm with the times of fasting and praying. And now, while some women reported having more time for religious practices and more flexibility in arranging their activities during the day, due to working from home or sadly losing their jobs, others were under extra pressure at work during the lockdown or had extra responsibilities at home because of the lockdown. So we start with the kind of example of the first situation. The respondent says, "This is the most I've ever been able to practice since I'm no longer in college and I can now work from home. So I am able to maintain a specific schedule this year that is more conducive to at-home Tarawih and night-focused worship." Another one summarizes her current Ramadan practice, saying, "Now I'm praying my 5 prayers on time. I rarely did because of crazy work shifts before, we assume," she says. "Now I'm jobless since April the 1st, so I have more time to be full-time mother, pray on time, and read the Quran." For many respondents, the change from collective to individual practice was significant and resulted in the change of frequency and quality of prayers. As is clearly illustrated in this quote, for some women, the isolation brought some positive outcomes. This woman talks about the power of individual prayer and how it brings out personal experience and emotion. "I've discovered that I love to pray alone too. I love how personal it is and how I can tap deep into my emotions, somewhere totally private," she says. As could be expected, the women also spoke about difficulties inherent in the lack of social interactions during Ramadan. It could be argued that this particular point in time, the pandemic, the resultant lockdown, together with the sense of vulnerability and being overwhelmed, put into sharper relief the illusory nature of the, I quote, "image of Islam as a perfectionist project of self-discipline," end of quote. This is a quote from Schilke, who in his research underscores the fragmented and often contradictory nature of lived Islamic practice. Taking as a theoretical point of departure, his critique of works by scholars such as Assad or Mahmoud, that in his view overestimates the degree of coherence of practice, he traces the push for abolition of ambivalence in lived Islam to modernist and reformist approaches that, I quote again, "emphasize rationality and purity." These approaches, as Marsden argues, are unable to confront the inconsistencies and complexities inherent in Muslim attempts to live virtuous lives. For respondents staying at home all day, this also meant that the staying at home all day meant a loss of structuring events with which religious practices are interwoven. This draws our attention to integrative, dynamic nature of lived religion. Many respondents had a deep sense of transition into abnormal reality and struggled to cope with it, as you can see in this quote. "I am terrible at praying when I'm home all day. I've tried reading the study Quran, but it's hard to concentrate without better segmentation of my day." And then we've got a similar quote below. In our data, we also found examples of the attempts to compensate for the loss of sociality this Ramadan. And one woman, for example, told us about trying to pray more often around iftar time, when in normal circumstances she would be breaking the fast, usually in the company of others. In this next quote that I am showing you here, we can see the palpable sense of the loss of connection, which closes for some the possibility for a full Ramadan experience. It also illustrates how some respondents reflect on alternative modalities of it. In doing so, they analyze and open up the possibility for reconfiguration of the experience that was defined by annual routines and schedules. And you can see this attempt clearly here in this quote. Now I'm going to the next section of our findings to do with the personal development and self-projects. In the light of recent literature on religion and consumer culture, the divisions between what is strictly religious, spiritual, and strictly secular have never appeared more contrived. So various transformative self-projects that entail self-care, self-acceptance, spiritual work, and ethical cultivation are inextricably bound with religious belief and practice. Jeffrey Kenny argues that the valorization of self-exploration and self-fulfillment facilitates blending of modern ideas and ethical practices legitimized through their association with tradition. And this blending fosters new understanding of what it means to be Muslim in modern world. The themes of healing and well-being, vital in the consumerist culture, are identified across religious traditions, including Islam. Meredith McGuire argues that lived religion encompasses some embodied practices which do not appear to be religious, yet are vital for cultivation of a religious identity. Now, the quote here illustrates how the respondents reshape traditional religious practices in individualistic and pragmatic ways. And this extract, C, discusses personal integration of elements that traditionally might be considered discrete. So she talks about religious practice, such as prayer, various environmentally friendly conscious behavior, such as giving up plastic, and emotional labor for her community, making uplifting posts. We thought that this was a particularly poignant example of reconfigured religiosity. Lived everyday religion is also very often linked to the concepts of private or privatized religion and spirituality. These in turn emphasize the role of autonomy and personal experience rather than traditional religious institutions. And here you can see the narrative by Kay, who links quietness and solitude with increased spiritual balance of Ramadan. Part of me does think that Ramadan is meant to be much more quiet than the way most of the community participates in it, she says. And I think being under lockdown kind of forces that spiritual aspect of Ramadan to be much more prominent. So Kay focuses on interiority and appreciation of solitude, and that way she highlights a somewhat critical approach to the normative practice of collective Ramadan celebration. A focus on positive thinking and positive practice provides the means for controlling and improving the self. The virtues to be achieved are formulated in manifold ways and include self-motivation, self-autonomy, self-improvement for oneself and others, self-acceptance, love that underpin the sense of identity and well-being. This Ramadan, I'm trying to cultivate self-motivation and self-accountability, says one of our respondents. Although not connected with Islam, they help me to do ibadah. And then we've got another quote highlighting similar features of our respondents' practices. So Islam here becomes a Foucault's technology of self, geared to affect individuals, I quote, operations on their bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. Abi's reflection, so these respondents that you can see in the quotes displayed now, her reflection on Islam making her a better person, not just for herself, but for others as well, demonstrates a particular kind of sociality, we would argue. So it's a religious orientation to the collectivity that points to the intersecting and gender obligations, expectations, and master narratives that change the view of privatized religion as disconnected from community. The discourse of self-acceptance, self-love, and transformation may be seen as an expression of the, I quote, values of individualism and neoliberal understandings of subjectivity, end of quote. However, they are facilitated by Islam. In this process, the self not only acquires new dimensions absent from in more traditional understandings of the moral self, but becomes sacralized alongside subjective life choices. Another example we can give you here is the case of AG. She's a Black Muslim widow with a very busy professional life. And for her, the transformation has significance from the social context perspective. Single Black motherhood is frequently demonized and criminalized. And so AG manages to transform stigmatizing narratives about herself into profoundly positive subjectivity. The self-project goes beyond the spiritual, internal realm, and it involves also the embodied self. We asked our respondents about their self-care practices during the lockdown. The responses referenced healthy eating, achieving good sleep patterns, exercising, and attending to various beauty regimes, as you can see in these quotes. The boundary between the modern preoccupation with bodies driven by consumerist culture and the traditional Islamic embracement of the body, with its emphasis on looking after the body in religious texts, is blurred here again. While the lockdown enabled many women to better look after their physical needs and physical selves, others reported additional challenges in bodily self-care. And the challenges are displayed in these quotes here. We would argue that by lamenting the lack of time or opportunities for bodily self-care, our respondents highlight again the extended embodied nature of self, that here is the focus of self-transformation projects. And now over to Anna.
Thank you. Can you stop sharing your screen so I can share mine?
Yes, I'll do my best to do that. I'm sorry for this. Just trying to find my bearings quickly.
There should be a little strip sort of at the edge of your Zoom window. Okay, I think I'm sharing now. So I'll take over for the next section and until the end of the presentation. Responses to decreased social interaction. Those indicated one of the major fault lines in our data. For some women in our sample, the break from collective religious practice was a welcome one. They enjoyed less interaction, even with extended family and friends, and less distraction, so that they were able to maintain their engagement in observing Ramadan. I'm discovering the value of relative solitude. Days and nights are spent at home and less complicated, less social in a good way, less distraction and less stress overall from having to go to dinner parties and have guests over. Another participant said, solace in isolation, all this time alone for meditation and reflection. In a few cases, the cessation of interactions with family members and the wider community was embraced. I'm just I'm having technical difficulties with the sharing. My PowerPoint is not changing. Just a moment. Okay, so for some reason I cannot change my slides. So I was wondering if perhaps Joanna could share and I could talk. Would that be okay? Okay. Can you do a slideshow, Joanna? Great. So if you change to the next slide, thank you. Yes, and the next one. So it's been great during lockdown in Ramadan. No judgmental in-laws, no groups of brothers loitering on the streets, says one of our respondents. For many, however, loneliness and the loss of community connection, however tenuous, had a negative impact on their general well-being and religious practice. It's been tough. Kay says, I'm used to attending my place of prayer about twice a week and having community events on top of that, so it has been quite a jarring shift. This is my first Ramadan as a Muslim, and I was really looking forward to spending time with my community, says AA. I'm struggling a bit with being alone, but trying to find a blessing in all situations, alhamdulillah. It is important to note that there are many women, regardless of affiliation or ideological stance, for whom mosque attendance offers spiritual and psychological benefits. Some researchers interviewed women attending mosques in the UK and in Norway, and they found that the women described feelings of tranquility, spiritual connection to God, experience akin to therapy. The women often use sermons as starting points for the study, often delving into sources and commentaries later at home. Okay, can I have the next slide? In contrast to many respondents who narrated the recent reconfiguration of religious and social practice due to isolation, some respondents who linked their experiences to being converts, transgender, queer, or disabled or feminist, reported having been unmosqued for a long time. While there is an increase in progressive women-led LGBT affirming mosques, these tend to be founded in larger cities, such as Chicago, LA, Toronto, Berlin, or London. For those living in rural places, those institutions are inaccessible. The lockdown has certainly highlighted the challenges experienced by this diverse group, as large swaths of the community are now also experiencing isolation. Amid the growing sense of crisis and shifts within the customary ways of doing religion, pockets of effervescence emerged, bringing together people online. This coming together was facilitated by online social media and the debates in traditional media outlets reporting on the impact of the COVID-19 restrictions on religious communities. Durkheim described effervescence as the, quote, rhythmic entrainment of all participants into a mood that feels stronger than any of them individually and carries them along as if under a force from outside, unquote. As the effervescence emerged, it was continually constrained by the pandemic conditions, notably the lockdown. The sense of isolation experienced by some of the respondents, the unmosqued group in particular, for a very long time before the pandemic, gave way to active coming together online. The new situation may have acted as a catalyst. As many researchers argue, a sense of common religious dedication does tend to surge during and immediately after major external crisis. In our sample, the increased sense of belonging and redefinition of the community of faith was most remarkable among the non-conforming Muslims. And here we've got a very good quote that illustrates that. So one of our respondents says, right before the pandemic started, I had made niyyah, intention to attend Jummah prayer each week. Obviously, this didn't happen. As Ramadan approached, I had inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I created a virtual masjid, Dar ul Garib, for queer Muslims, mostly femme and non-binary, who already are generally isolated in the larger Muslim community. Alhamdulillah, this has helped us all have a home, even if we can't congregate physically. We hold congregational prayer daily, as well as Quran reading and classes. And here we've got a little sort of snippet of our respondent basically giving a khutbah on YouTube. So
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفر الله ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ما يضله فلا مضل له وما يضلل فلا هادي له. They all agree that at the very least, Laylatul Qadr is found in the last 10 days of Ramadan. Okay? And many of them agree that it's always going to fall on an odd night. We have many different hadith that say it's going to be on an odd night. However, none of the madhahib can really reach a consensus on exactly which night is Laylatul Qadr. Okay? Shia Muslims generally believe that it's on the 21st, and that's because of the hadith that I just read, where the Prophet ﷺ was revealed about the night of Qadr, and then immediately had it that night on the 21st. As for Sunni scholars, many say that it's on the 27th, and that's due to various different ahadith. But Imam Ahmad, Imam Malik, and Abu Sufyan, and a lot of others say that it changes every year and it does not have a specific night.
This is just to give you an overview, sort of visually, what such an online mosque could look like. In our ongoing study on Polish Muslim converts' experiences, we found accounts of social alienation, particularly during holidays such as Ramadan. Without the Muslim family, converts rely much more on the community and communal events in mosques and cultural centers. Some of our converted respondents living side by side with communities of born Muslims also reported being made to feel unwelcome. And here we've got another quote, that's actually three quotes that illustrate that. Unfortunately, I have never had any sort of physical community to be a part of because I'm transgender. So my coping strategy of going online is my only means of really connecting to the Muslim community. Another says, physical spaces such as mosques are extremely misogynist, so I'm not involved with them anyway. Other events in progressive spaces are few and far between, and I often can't attend them due to disability. So now that everything is online, it's great. And another one says, I have always felt isolated within the Muslim community where I live. They are mostly Palestinian at the masjids, and they are very skeptical towards reverts. The next next theme that emerged was related to family. And again, we've got a few nice quotes to illustrate some of the points, some of the sort of reflections that we made. The importance of family as an important nexus for religious practice and faith formation is strongly reflected in literature on Judaism and Christianity. But there seems to be a gap in this respect in the context of Islam, despite it being an explicitly family-centered religion. As we mentioned earlier, the lockdown variously highlighted and transformed collective family religious practices and dynamics. Extant literature on intergenerational family prayer suggests that it may function as a time for family togetherness, interaction, support, and transmission of religion. The increase in time spent together has led for some to more closeness, bonding, and better communication, as the following quotes demonstrate. Because there is not much involvement of the outside world, we can spend more time to focus on each other at home and improve, listen to each other, for example, and be more open about each other's needs. spending time with family, praying with my daughters, and studying more on Islam during this time. Religious practices may also help in reducing relational tensions. Like here, we are more relaxed and patient being at home while fasting and unable to go out. We try to utilize our time as much as possible. Especially at the time of the pandemic, fraught with all kinds of tension, having access to relatives with whom one can pray and fast together may help overcome hardship, such as depression, anxiety, or alienation. This chimes in with Meyerhoff's definition of ritual as occurring in sacred time and space that is outside of mundane reality, allowing for respite and redirection. Fies et al. Found that, quote, rituals affirm relationships, connect behaviors with values, and involve a symbolic component, unquote. Importantly, meaning associated with joint religious practices is more strongly related to marital and family well-being than just the practice of the ritual itself. Family rituals involve affective and symbolic communication, featuring disruptive as well as supportive elements. Some respondents mentioned proximity to relatives resulting from the lockdown challenging. As this participant here explained, feelings of frustration and anger about her entrapment with a large family pod stand in the way of a full Ramadan experience. She says, I've been irritated and angry a lot this Ramadan, and I wish I wasn't. I'm surrounded by 100 relatives, which has its pros, but many cons. Here we see the other side of the coin related to the lockdown. Cultivation of solitude, so enjoyed by others, emerges as an unattainable coping strategy. Instead, the respondent and her family are exposed to overcrowding in the home, considered in psychology and counseling to be chronic stressors that often lead to family conflict. The respondent is unable to achieve inner peace, a sense of generosity or compassion that define Ramadan. The responses also suggested some fluctuations in gender role dynamics in both more and less traditional Muslim homes. The following quotes were offered by respondents, both of whom relished the role that this year's Ramadan offered to them. My husband and my two oldest sons will take it in turns to lead the prayers as imams, reading a short sermon followed by prayers in congregation. In the family, she means. Our ladies of the community are keeping busy by continuing to care about the welfare of the neighbors, friends, and other ladies of the community. Another one says, I've always felt that in my studies, that he was leading me to queer theology, but I never would have thought that he would lead me to be essentially a woman imam. A few years ago, I would have laughed at this idea. We plan and Allah plans, but he is the best of planners. Family emerges here as a context that is imbued with power and hierarchy. Rituals simultaneously validate and are validated by symbolic systems that produce long-term relationships. In these two examples, Ramadan-related practices provide the logic for performance of or a resistance to hierarchical gender roles. It is interesting to see how during the pandemic, gender dynamics and religious agency become affirmed and augmented. In the more conservative family of respondent AF, religious authority was claimed by male family members, while care for the vulnerable community members, a traditionally feminized task, was assigned to women. In contrast, in the non-traditionally structured and functioning family of Q, who is queer and polyamorous, it was female authority that was consolidated through her enactment of prayer leadership and preaching. We have one slide that draws on data from a second round survey that we are still sort of, it's still active. But we thought that these quotes would merit inclusion in the presentation because we wanted to demonstrate the contradictory nature of religious meaning-making processes, often embodied by discrepancies between scriptural and lived religion. So here we've got quotes by AJ, a Black convert to Salafism living in the northeastern US, and she uses Islam to make sense of racism in the Salafi community and the wider American society. As a Black Muslim niqab-wearing woman, she faces intersecting challenges that affect her sense of belonging. The difference between what is and what should be, both in terms of idealized and lived Islam, but also in terms of idealized and lived Americanness, hangs on her experience of race and racism. Her narratives here reflect the tensions between her understanding of Islam as a perfect way of life as we see in the first quote, and the racism and silencing she and her family have experienced in their religious community, as seen in the second quote. The ambivalence of her narrative is underscored further by her account of her missing the motivation, quote, that comes with gathering with people that encourage you religiously, unquote, as she is too anxious to attend the masjid during the pandemic right now. We are going to skip a few slides, which in my version are which are cut because we just realized we didn't have time to go through them, and we're just going to go into the conclusions. So a classic sort of conference situation we've got here, but this, yeah, if we could just go to the conclusion slide, and perhaps we can share something of this during the questions. Yes, thank you. Peake has argued that 9/11, a crisis event steeped in cultural politics reaching well beyond the US, led to the formation of an identity of crisis among American and European Muslims. For many, the religious identity has become much more central for their personal and social selves at that time, as Islam came under intense scrutiny and Muslims experienced heightened hostility. Although the ongoing pandemic is a very different crisis than 9/11, we argue that it has contributed to the emergence of a particular identity of crisis, shaped variously by social distancing, changes in the work mode, such as remote work, more risky in-person work, and loss of employment, and frequently a reconfigured mode of religious comportment that relies strongly on individual and online or collective practices. Being deprived of the possibility to gather in collective ritual and related community-based activities came as a joyful discovery for some, while to others it represented an ambiguous impoverishment of the religious experience. On the whole, it appears that the changes in social interaction have led to a reevaluation of salient aspects of the religious identity for many surveyed women. For others, it highlighted long-standing modalities of exclusion. Our data highlights pluralization of religious experience. It remains to be seen whether the temporary loss of in-person collective worship undermines the influence of traditional institutional authority. It is quite possible that the growth of new forms of religious organizing may lead to institutionalization of alternative authorities on a much larger scale, especially on the wave of new welcoming and all-inclusive mosques in Western Europe and North America. We are hoping that the follow-up online survey we're running right now will add some more puzzle pieces to this picture. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both Joanna and Anna, for this incredibly rich presentation that I think gives us so much to think about. And I think it's fascinating to hear about the kind of simultaneous alienating and franchising dimensions of experience that many of your respondents seem to share with you. So we have now at least 15 or 20 minutes available for questions and discussion. There's various ways that those of you who have joined us can enter the conversation. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the raise hand feature, which is available to you in the participant window. You should have an option there available, and I can already see a hand being raised. We'll get to you, Laura, in just a moment. Another way to kind of get your name on the list to ask a question is simply to let me know in the chat box that you'd like to ask a question, or if you'd prefer to just type the question directly into the chat box, we can deal with it that way. Let me turn first to a consistent participant in our series, Laura Jones. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you to Anna and Joanna for the presentation today. It was fascinating for me because my research is on, my PhD is on Ramadan in Britain, and obviously given lockdown, I've been looking at Ramadan in lockdown, and I collected photo diaries from Ramadan to do that, and I could see a lot of similarities coming out in terms of a lot of the things you'll talk about. I won't go into it, but my question was actually about your methods and what type of methods you used. I'm assuming it was interviews, but if you could just tell me more about that. And also about the kind of, you talked a bit about the demographics of the people you spoke to, but I was more interested in kind of their family situation. So were they married, single, and how, was there any bearing of that on the responses they gave you?
Thank you. So it was not interviews. It was actually an online survey with open-ended questions. I think we had 8 questions, and we distributed that survey, wherever we could through groups, and we tried to keep it sort of balanced in that we found some, so you could say non-conforming groups for women and more sort of traditionalists. So it was not the usual amount of data that you get with interviews. And to be honest, we did not ask about their marital status. I don't think. We asked more about the location and the Islamic affiliation. And the information about family came up organically in the responses. So I guess we could try to sort of recreate that. I don't know if it could be consistent across the sample, but we just wanted to experiment specifically with a bigger sort of distribution of participants, and perhaps not such huge amounts of data as would come with interviews. I don't know, Joanna, I want to add something.
Yeah, I guess this was also a very pragmatic choice. Because the idea for the research came as the lockdown was upon us, so to say. We kind of understood from our personal experience that people are already under lots of strain, and finding people who would be willing to spend an hour or longer doing a proper in-depth interview, well, that seemed a difficult prospect for us. So hence the kind of convenience sample in a way, with an emphasis on the non-conforming Muslims, and this kind of easy, do it in your own time, open-ended survey.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Good, thanks very much, and thank you, Laura, for your question. Turning now to Farid Esak. Please, Farid, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Peter. A very quick one. What was your criteria or your definition of non-conforming Muslims? Because I seem to gather that most of your sample, if not all, were what you call non-conforming Muslims. So what kind of definition did you employ in arriving at that? Thank you very much. And thank you very much for a great presentation. Sorry about that.
Thanks. We borrowed the use of non-conforming from Katrina Daly Thompson, who just had a really good article published in the American Anthropologist about the importance of sort of corporeal prayer for performance of the Muslim identity by people who normally would not be welcome in a sort of mainstream mosque. So she included in that sample basically LGBT people, genderqueer, as well as people who, for whatever reason, did not feel comfortable. So that also includes converts and also a segment of the female population that are uncomfortable with the sort of placement of women in a traditional mosque. So Katrina offers a huge theoretical discussion, and to be honest, I read the paper and I did not note down her definition to offer it right now, but it's basically people sort of on the outside of the mainstream.
Joanna, anything that you would like to add to that? No. Okay. Sorry, put myself on mute. Other questions? If you don't mind, I would like to ask about, I've always been fascinated by the ways in which events and crises like such as a pandemic kind of creates a state of exception that then allows certain kinds of norms and practices to potentially be challenged, or just by its nature kind of forces a re-examination of habits that we kind of take for granted, or view as defining the boundaries of what constitutes conforming, and thereby necessarily involves a recalibration of the boundaries of what would constitute nonconformity. And I was particularly interested in the extent to which you sensed from your sense in your research and from your work, the idea that the pandemic may be kind of creating new kinds of preferences, and leading people to discover ways of being Muslim that they might intend to continue with, even after and if we ever return to something like normality, such that rather than this being a description of a temporary state of affairs, the kind of pandemic actually opens up new pathways that may endure and continue beyond the temporal boundaries of at least the kind of most acute crisis phase of the pandemic. I guess, are we seeing the emergence of something like a new Muslim normal because of the pandemic when it comes to religiosity and practice?
Mm-hmm. I think a Puritan answer to your question would be, well, we need to wait and do the kind of longitudinal research to be able to answer that question. But I think what we've noticed were some changes that were really kind of reaching the identity level. And I think when it comes to that we can discuss these reconfigurations, various reconfigurations that we've observed in these quotes and in our data. In terms of identity shifts, there is, well, some, you could say, hope or some probability that these new modes of being a Muslim won't be that temporary, that they might be actually going beyond this crisis, pandemic, and so on. And there might be some long-lasting effects of these renegotiations. But we need to wait and see.
Anna, anything to add?
I think it's difficult to say how permanent those changes will be. And to be honest, I was actually quite surprised when I came across a piece of statistic that it's only 20% of American Muslims actually regularly attend the mosque. And that just made me realize that here we're talking, about a very sort of particular group, because organically, 80% either would not want to or wouldn't be able to go and practice at the mosque. However, I think the fact that a particular sort of modality of exclusion for people who would normally go to the mosque and practice just sort of, widens the perspective maybe a little bit, that, it is possible to imagine now what it feels like for others who would like to but cannot go and worship at the mosque. So, I mean, it remains to be seen, but it's, I think, a really interesting exercise in empathy, perhaps for some.
Mm-hmm. And I think, if I may add just to that, this was highlighted in Professor Andrea Stanton's presentation when she was showing us, how the posters or the guidelines for mosques that were shut and then reopened kind of changed, and they became more inclusive in terms of women's participation, for example.
Great, thank you very much. We have a few more minutes available for questions, or also alternatively or an opportunity for you to maybe briefly touch on those aspects of your work that you had to skip over. I'm also working to paste into the chat box a link to the article by Katrina Thompson that you mentioned about how she thinks about non-conformity.
Great. You were able to find it. That's great.
It was a challenge, but I think I think I did. Yeah.
Literally, it's just been published, so it's not like it's online first sort of, but it's online.
Okay, I think this is it, or at least we'll get you there if I'm not incorrect. It looks like it was September 2020, so very recent. Okay, great. So that's in the chat box for those of you who are interested in seeing how she defines some things about nonconformity. Good. So I think we're actually at full time now. And so I just wanted to thank our presenters for sharing their research with us one last time. I also wanted to let those of you know that the next presentation in our webinar series will be taking place on November 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it's a little bit different from all of our preceding presentations, which have tended to be by scholars who work understandably on the contemporary world. And in this case, on November 17th, we'll be hearing from a historian, Professor Günhan Börekçi from the Central European University in Vienna, who will be offering a presentation called Long Before COVID-19, the Socioeconomic Effects of Contagious Diseases and Epidemics in the Ottoman World, 1500 to 1800. So providing some historical context for Islam's encounter with large-scale outbreaks of infectious disease and a perspective that we haven't had in the series so far. So for one last time, thank you, Anna, thank you, Joanna, for sharing your research with us. We look very much forward to seeing it develop and wish you all the best with your project.